term sovereign democracy has become a catchphrase in political discourse, particularly in post-Soviet states like Russia. Coined and popularized by political strategist Vladislav Surkov in the early 2000s, sovereign democracy purports to describe a political system where democratic institutions operate in a manner consistent with national traditions and values, free from external interference. While this sounds benign, or even noble on the surface, a deeper examination reveals that the term is not just ambiguous, but actively misleading. In reality, sovereign democracy is a rhetorical smokescreen used to justify authoritarian governance while maintaining a veneer of democratic legitimacy. This essay explores the origins, usage, and implications of the term and argues that it is essentially a form of political nonsense, a contradiction in terms, a cover for undemocratic practices, and a manipulation of language for authoritarian ends. The origins of sovereign democracy. The concept of sovereign democracy emerged in Russia under President Vladimir Putin's rule. It was developed by Vladislav Surkov, who was then deputy head of the presidential administration. Surkov argued that Russia needed a form of democracy that was adapted to its unique historical, cultural, and political conditions, one that prioritized national sovereignty and resisted foreign influence. At face value, this sounds reasonable. Nations should indeed have the right to chart their own political paths. But Surkov's innovation wasn't merely about cultural sensitivity or self-determination. Instead, it was a calculated move to shield the Russian political system from external criticism, particularly from the West, while continuing to use democratic vocabulary to maintain legitimacy at home and abroad. The Kremlin's narrative claimed that liberal democracy, as practiced in Western countries, was unsuitable for Russia. Instead, a sovereign democracy, a system with elections, parliaments, and other formal institutions, but tightly controlled by the executive, would provide stability and prevent chaos. The idea quickly took hold in official rhetoric and became a cornerstone of Putin's political philosophy. Definitional absurdity. The term sovereign democracy is problematic from the outset because it combines two fundamentally contradictory ideas. Democracy, by definition, involves public participation in governance, accountability, transparency, and the protection of civil liberties. Sovereignty, in this context, becomes a euphemism for unchecked executive power. In practice, sovereign democracy often means that the ruling elite can do whatever they want under the guise of protecting national interests. Elections may still take place, but they are tightly managed. Opposition parties are marginalized, media is controlled, and civil society is stifled. The formal structure of democracy exists, but the substance is hollow. Thus, the phrase becomes Orwellian. It uses the language of freedom to justify repression. It claims to be democratic while removing the very mechanisms that make democracy meaningful. It is a classic case of what philosopher Harry Frankfurt would call bullshit, language used not to communicate truth but to manipulate perceptions. A tool of authoritarianism. Sovereign democracy is not merely a theoretical construct, it is a practical tool for consolidating authoritarian rule. In Russia, it has provided a framework for the suppression of political opposition and the centralization of power. Elections are held, but the outcomes are predictable. Political pluralism is nominal. Dissent is labeled as foreign interference. The judiciary is politicized, and the media serves as an instrument of state propaganda. By labeling critics as enemies of national sovereignty, the regime avoids engaging with their arguments. Any call for transparency, human rights, or genuine democratic reform is dismissed as a Western plot to undermine the nation. The discourse of sovereign democracy thus delegitimizes internal opposition and shields the regime from external scrutiny. This model has also found resonance in other authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. Leaders in countries like Turkey, Hungary, and China have adopted similar rhetoric to justify restrictions on freedom, arguing that their nations must protect their sovereignty from foreign influence. In each case, the effect is the same. Democracy becomes a shell and sovereignty becomes an excuse for despotism. The paradox of sovereignty. Another reason sovereign democracy is nonsense is because it misunderstands the nature of sovereignty itself. In a true democracy, sovereignty lies with the people. The state is merely an instrument of the collective will. But in sovereign democracy, the state claims to own sovereignty and wields it against the people, ostensibly on their behalf. This inversion of sovereignty is deeply undemocratic. Instead of empowering citizens, it renders them passive subjects. The people no longer govern, they are governed. Elections serve not to choose leaders, but to ratify decisions already made by a ruling elite. Dissent is equated with treason, and political participation is reduced to ritual. The concept is thus a contradiction. If a democracy is truly sovereign, it must be governed by the people. If sovereignty is monopolized by the state, then democracy is impossible. The two ideas cannot coexist in the way proponents of sovereign democracy claim. The phrase is not just vague, it is conceptually incoherent. Weaponizing language. Political theorists and linguists have long understood the power of language in shaping perception. George Orwell, in his famous essay Politics and the English Language, warned that euphemistic and convoluted language is often used to obscure truth and justify the unjustifiable. Sovereign democracy is a perfect example of such linguistic manipulation. The term is designed to neutralize criticism. It allows regimes to say, "We are democratic," even as they crush political opposition. It appeals to nationalist sentiments and frames foreign criticism as imperialistic interference. It turns the debate away from substantive issues such as the rule of law or free expression and onto vague ideas of sovereignty and cultural uniqueness. This is not just a matter of semantics, it has real-world consequences. By manipulating language, authoritarian regimes manipulate public consciousness. Citizens are encouraged to see repression as protection, control as stability, and autocracy as democracy. In this way, sovereign democracy becomes a tool of psychological as well as political domination. Why it persists. Despite its absurdity, sovereign democracy continues to be a popular rhetorical device. There are several reasons for this. First, it provides a simple justification for complex problems. Political stagnation, blame foreign meddling. Economic inequality, say it's part of defending sovereignty. Human rights abuses, argue that they're necessary for national security. Second, the concept has emotional appeal. It wraps authoritarianism in the flag. It tells people they are special, different, and under threat. It transforms obedience into patriotism and discourages critical thinking. It offers certainty in a world of ambiguity and stability in a time of change. Finally, it serves the interests of those in power. By redefining democracy to mean whatever they say it means, rulers avoid accountability. They can claim democratic legitimacy while silencing dissent. They can rig elections while boasting of electoral participation. In short, they get the best of both worlds, the appearance of democracy without the risks. Sovereign democracy is a rhetorical illusion. It dresses up authoritarianism in democratic language and uses nationalism to justify repression. It undermines the very principles it claims to uphold, turning democracy into a facade and sovereignty into a shield for tyranny. As political discourse becomes more polluted with euphemisms and doublethink, it is essential to call out nonsense when we see it. Sovereign democracy is not a new form of democracy adapted to national conditions. It is a betrayal of democracy itself. Recognizing this is the first step toward reclaiming the integrity of our political language, and with it, the possibility of genuine democratic governance.